famous for the battle in Seattle, right? Well, we lost the battle in Seattle as soon as it got called the battle in Seattle, because what's in the frame, what's missing from the frame of the Battle of Seattle? The WTO is missing from that frame, okay? So that's not good if you're going to try to win the story, the battle of the story, to not have your nefarious foe, adversary, your compelling villain in the frame, in the title. It's missing, right? So it becomes about this battle that we had with the cops that we lost and we deserved to lose because we were rioting in downtown Seattle. Now, none of that's true, but that's become the prevailing story. And so every time Seattle's brought up in my history, it's, John Sellers and the Ruckus Society were at the center of the violent riots in Seattle. Whereas, the cops started the riots. We were doing our job as nonviolent revolutionaries by exposing the injustice and the power and the violence that the state uses to control thought and to control, dissidents. So think about, think about our actions. How many actions do you know which, are about a campaign, about a critical thing, like climate change? We're seeing a lot of police repression against ramps folks around the country, and folks, all the climate people are getting cranked down on by big dirty energy right now. And the story that the story that the power structure wants to tell is cops versus protesters. That's the story that they're really comfortable with, and they want to keep it at that level. And maybe the cops got a little out of hand, and maybe they didn't, but it's a nice, easy story to tell. Cops versus protesters, and it's a battle, and it's kind of sexy because shit gets broken and all that kind of stuff. But it's not the fucking story that we want to tell. It's the story of the battle. It's not the battle of the story. So that's what I want to talk about today. So I'm gonna rifle through some slides of some different actions, and we can talk about the elements of the actions and how it becomes a powerful story, the symbology of it. And then I'm going to show a couple videos, and Bill specifically asked me to talk today about, we do a lot of actions now that we try to film in sort of real time from lots of different angles and create a compelling piece of media out of that action. And then, with Other 98, we're starting to get a pretty big pipe out to the public. We have a Facebook page that's going kind of Godzilla right now. We have, I think last time I checked, 750,000 people talking about us on Facebook today or this week. So when we build that pipe, we can then, one of the ways we built that pipe is by putting really good content into it consistently. We try not to put any shitty content, even if it's from our friends and we love the story, and we love, if it's not if it's the story of the battle, then we want to we a lot of times veto that stuff, because we want to put stuff that has a high bar, because we know we're competing with the man who owns the media, right? And they have a really high production value and a really high bar, and they put sexy shit in their pipe all the time that is seductive and grabs people. And so we're trying to do that same kind of thing. So, all right, I'll shut up and rifle through some cool images. All right, how do I do this now? There we go. Whoops. My computer was asleep there. All right, now I'll try it again. Okay, so what makes this a powerful symbol?
Stand up. Stand alone. Courage. Sacrifice. Asymmetry.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about, yeah, these are all right. The thing for me, the dominant thing that comes to mind is, as Bill said, the asymmetry of it. I mean, if you think about a good story, what do we love in a good story? We love the little guy fighting the big guy, right? Standing up to the big guy. The little person standing up to the bully. David and Goliath. This is like, you don't get more of that, more polarization of power and sort of single solitary courage than that one. So this is, a profoundly different shot. This is thousands of people doing something not profoundly courageous, but really cool. It's a critical mass bike ride in San Francisco, and the power of many juxtaposed with the power of one. So Gandhi was a master at provoking the state, exposing the violence of the state, exposing the moral degradation of the state repression, and he created actions that were simple, that had a very low bar for entry. This is the Salt March. It was illegal for Indians to make their own salt. India was sort of like the testing ground for corporate globalization. India was considered a raw material export platform for the British Empire. They could grow cotton, but they couldn't produce fabric. They had to export their cotton. It was illegal for them to produce fabric. They had to export their cotton to the textile mills of Britain and then import finished fabric back. So the Salt March, England made it illegal for Indians to produce their own salt, something that is essential to life. And so Gandhi decided to march hundreds and hundreds of miles to the sea, and thousands and thousands and thousands of Indians joined him. Grandmothers, grandfathers, young people, children, pregnant mothers. They could all take this action together. It was a popular action. They made the worst salt ever in history when they got to the beach, but that wasn't what was important. It was, the symbol of breaking that unjust law. This is classic civil disobedience, right? This is an unjust law that they're breaking. We rarely get to practice civil disobedience. We mostly practice nonviolent direct action. The spinning wheel is on the flag of India now. It became the symbol for this, for the Indian Revolution, India for Indians. And Gandhi, began to wear his own homespun as a symbol of his resistance to that corporate globalization. Gandhi inspired so many people around the world. The suffragists in the United States were inspired by him. Some cool old action stuff. This is the first sit-down strike. The labor movement was inspired by Gandhi and predated Gandhi. Of course, the labor movement in the United States is the second shining example of a multiracial solidarity movement. The first being the anti-slavery movement. Cesar Chavez and the farm workers. And one thing is really awesome to think about with these movements is that they were designing escalating campaigns of direct action that involved hundreds of thousands of people regularly, and that kept a level of popularity. They were trying to bring everyone in. They were trying not to scare anyone. They were trying not to turn off Americans. They were trying to turn on people and bring them in. And because they kept such an escalated level of power, they were meeting with, there's Bobby Kennedy and Dolores Huerta hanging out. King met with presidents on many occasions because they had real power. They created real social power. They were never the majority. They were always a small minority, but they were leveraged, and they would turn out people in actions. And they like you look at the civil rights movement, the FBI invented COINTELPRO. J. Edgar Hoover invented COINTELPRO to spy on King in the civil rights movement, right? But the civil rights movement did not get into a story of the battle about them versus J. Edgar Hoover and COINTELPRO. In fact, they decided not to elevate that struggle and to hide it from their followers, because they didn't want to scare little old ladies from coming home with their own FBI escort, right? They knew that it would actually alienate people from their movement. I think we get involved with this battle of story of the battle over and over and over again, and being repressed. It's like we go in there to talk about mountaintop removal, and then the whole issue is about us and the cops, and the story becomes about us and the cops. Yeah.
No, I was just like saying amen.
If Tom Hayden has a great quote, really great, white anti-racist guy who has a great history of revolutionary thought in this country. He's as movements become more successful, government becomes more repressive. You're not doing your job unless the cops are trying to break you and spy on you, and the state is trying to fuck with you. But you're not doing your job if you let that become the campaign either. So the civil rights movement, the students that broke the back of Jim Crow in the Deep South, especially the lunch counter sit-ins, they trained for, the first wave I think trained for 6 months before they went into the lunch counters with Reverend James Lawson, still a practicing preacher in Los Angeles. You can do nonviolence trainings with this guy. He's like a living history book legend. I encourage you, if you get a chance, to do a training with him.
What's his name again?
James Lawson, Lawson. Greatest book that I've ever read about social movements in the United States is a book called Parting the Waters, that is about the civil rights movement. It's written by Taylor Branch, massive book, but so rich with strategy and history. This is, again, the lunch counter sit-ins were a multiracial solidarity movement. White students from the North coming down, training with young black people from the South to go in and deal with unbelievable brutality in a completely nonviolent way. March on Washington, where King gave the "I Have a Dream" speech. The police department in Birmingham with their attack dogs. The Birmingham Fire Department not fighting fires that day.
Different fire.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're trying to put it out.
This is the Voting Rights March in Alabama. I love this image because the African Americans that were fighting Jim Crow and fighting apartheid in America, they were the poorest people, not in North America because certainly there was Mexicans that were poorer, but poorest people certainly north of Mexico, just sharecroppers. One set of nice clothes that they would wear to church, and that they would also wear into battle for first and state cops, because they didn't want to be written off by the American public. They thought about who their audience was and what the values of their audience were. They were trying to reach people who had much more mainstream values than they did, and so they put on their Sunday best because they didn't want to let stereotypes and intrinsic sort of racism get in the way of what their real message was. I think I have a lot of fights with neo-primitive anarchists about taking the bones out of their ears and their noses and stuff when they're going to be on camera, because I know that's super radical to look radical, but I think it's much more radical to look mainstream with a radical message than it is to look like a radical with a radical message.
Yeah, I wanted to point out that I had a talk with a bunch of black bloggers after we had on NATO, and I was telling them that whenever one thing about when you got to look at what the general popular story is about what people think you are, not what you are. So when people have a campaign for let's say they're trying to stop health clinics from being closed, and as soon as you get in front of it, the media has this already pre-made story they've been running on you for years that ends up becoming the topic and not the topic of the actual struggle. And the people of the struggle show solidarity because they don't want to say anything bad about them.
Right.
So they both kind of contribute to why they're, yeah.
I don't know, isn't that a tricky area?
Yeah.
I mean,
sure.
I think the other side winds up looking just as ridiculous half the time when you try to, sort of regain that. The first time Occupy Chicago tried to take Congress Plaza, there were some people who had it in their heads that we should dress nice.
Uh-huh.
We should look nice to counter this whole theory that we're all a bunch of dirty hippies and shit. And I was like, man, if I'm sitting out there waiting to go to jail, I'm going to dress comfortably. But a bunch of kids dressed up, and then they got marched into buses one at a time looking really nice.
Right.
And what did that accomplish? Nothing. Except we looked sillier, honestly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. It's a balance, and if you don't, nothing looks worse than hippies wearing shitty suits from thrift store, trying to look like Congress people. It just looks like hell, So I don't think you want to, whatever. It's a tension. It's interesting. It's something we should discuss more. Just one thing that my brain's too old, so when stuff comes to the front of it, I just have to spit it out. So one thing that people have been enamored with for a long time, Seattle Seattle, I think, in a lot of ways, made us victims of our own success. Back then, we wanted to keep repeating, like we wanted to shut down every city that was having a major thing, and we wanted to, we never had that element of surprise again. We kept trying to do the exact same action again, even though they had learned all the steps to our ballet. And I think people like to do that too. But what I was going to say is people became very enamored with the regalia of tear gas and pepper spray, right? Everybody was like, well, I'm going to wear goggles, and I'm going to wear a gas mask, and I'm going to wear a mask, and I'm going to do all this shit. And when we do that stuff, like, I feel like we give away our humanity. Because a story, a powerful story, you have to have sympathetic characters in that story. You have to have villains, compelling villains that are sexy and you want to fuck with, but you have to have sympathetic characters who are standing up to them, right? When I put a mask and goggles and shit on, I stop looking like a sympathetic character. In a gas mask, it's hard for me to look like a sympathetic character. Because my job as a nonviolent revolutionary is to actually get them to pepper spray me right in the face without my goggles on to show that the state's willing to do that shit. But when I wear my gas mask to the thing in the first place, and I put my gas mask on before the cops put theirs on, what kind of escalating tensions are you creating there when you create when you're showing up with the expectation that they're going to fuck with you in the first place?
Or you're dressing for battle.
Yeah, exactly. You're dressing for battle.
Right.
Dehumanize yourself.
So a bunch of people are...
I just wanted to say in regards to the imagery and all of the imagery of the civil rights, that's their Sunday best. That's their most principled, authentic self. If we put on costumes of things we are not, then that doesn't work. But when we wear our principled Sunday best, that's a different thing. So
good point.
We shouldn't wear.
I hardly ever wear a suit, but I will shave and I will just fix my shit up a bit to be on camera.
Yeah, it needs to be authentic and principled in our imagery.
You don't have to wear like full-time tail.
No.
Unless you're doing the billionaires, and then it
Right.
really works. Yeah.
I think about, who's watching the news. Let's say an action, gets on the news. So who's watching the news? Which instantly I can go to, my family, who's very conservative. They're nice people. They're, my mom will hear about something. She's like, well, I had no idea that's going on. I mean, it's remarkable, and yet, she's a good person. But when she sees, stuff going on, it's like, it's like, these crazy young people, or these, but when people have a different presentation, I'm always like, who is my audience? Like you said, who is the audience that I'm going for? It's not about me rebelling or showing my power as much as showing in numbers that kind of solidarity and the peacefulness. Because what's going to get to my mom is seeing people in humanity, like you're saying, in calmly, you know what I mean? Because I've noticed, like, for example, I was really involved with a lot of the LGBT, like, Prop 8 and all that kind of stuff, and there's a lot of, like, yelling, and there's a lot of signs that are saying stuff, but what really got to my mom is seeing an 80-year-old lesbian couple who's, like, crying because they finally got to get married. And my mom, who has no, like, I just had no idea, all of a sudden she's like, well, Daisy, why would people be against love? So it's like that kind of imagery, because we need to speak to the mainstream, because we're all preaching to the choir here, essentially.
Right. And so who's part of your action? Like, who's your action team? Do you have some sympathetic characters on your action team? Like, do you have someone who's having their house taken away? Or is it all sort of outside smoke jumpers, from Occupy Wall Street that are there? So because the camera, like the media is going to be on the action team, right? So can you elevate a sympathetic character story through your action? Can you actually have them represented on your team? It's a really good point. For me, it's not just my parents. My parents are a really good litmus test, for whether an action was really inviting and really, did it, for me, it's like, would it scare my grandmother? Would she want to be there, or would it scare her? If it would scare Rita, who's no longer with us, for me, it is borders on violence. Like, I'm not saying it is violent, but if it looks and feels violent, like when the Black Bloc shows up and there are tens of thousands of people that we worked really hard to get out there in a nonviolent way, and then they create a dangerous situation for those people, then I think that it becomes violence. And whether the violence gets started by the cops or not, we didn't do everything we could proactively to create a powerful revolutionary experience for all the mainstream people that we got out there. All right, so I'm going to keep rifling.
Do you have the Freedom Riders in there?
I don't. I have to move up into more modern times. So, I mean, the civil rights movement spawned, a number of other movements in the United States. The peace movement, the environmental movement, the more modern women's movement. A lot of them kind of spawn out of the civil rights movement. These are conscientious objectors. Famous action at Kent State, guy putting flowers down the barrel of the soldier's guns, creating a dichotomy. So I think some folks that have sort of an innate sympathetic character nature to them are older people, grandmothers particularly, and grandfathers, and young people. So very old people because they've seen it all and they've lived through it all, and they have wisdom that we should listen to, and a moral authority as grandparents. And I think very young people because they're going to live here much longer than we are and inherit everything that we do, and so they have a force as well. I think often like you can get labeled as sort of pimping kids, like manipulating kids in political situations you want to stay away from, but little kids in righteous action can be super powerful if it's done well. So just some different images of creating sort of a story in the image itself. Crosses in front of a nuclear plant. This is an action in England where the community itself, these are the sympathetic characters, they're literally climbing over the walls of a nuclear reprocessing facility, and they did millions of dollars, millions of pounds of property damage inside that facility that day. They mixed up concrete and poured it down shafts. I mean, they went to town on this place, right? But they did it in a way that is much different from the black bloc showing up and beating up at McDonald's, right? They had a celebration. They had different colored teams. They had a pink team, a white team, an orange team. Nobody was masked up. And they did this stuff, and then they said, yeah, we did it. They stayed around, and they said, we did it because we live here, and you're killing us, and you're killing our kids, and we all have cancer, and we're not going to stand by and let this place, do this to us anymore. And they were, it wasn't seen as a violent act. It was seen as a destructive act. I think Europe is far ahead of the United States general public in seeing property destruction as political. Like, I don't think we could get away with this action in the United States without people, going to jail basically forever. Katya Komisarek, who was our lawyer during the WTO, did 5 years in the federal penitentiary for doing a plowshares action, destroying some computers at a Aegis missile site. She put herself through Harvard Law while she was in prison and came out and was our lawyer during the WTO. But but it's interesting. I think I've gotten the chance to cut some drift nets with Greenpeace. I cut a 25-kilometer drift net, and we started stealing it and got in a fight with the fishermen. And it was one of the most non-violent things I've ever done in my life, doing this property destruction. But it's really tough to think about and talk about and create stuff that is going to be understood as political and as non-violent when you're doing that, when you're kind of crossing that line. I don't know how much time I have, Bill, and I have a lot of slides, and I don't know what I can get to some of the videos and talk about some of the action videos. I don't want to. Well, I don't want to try to do too much and leave out the stuff that you really want to get to.
Right. So, you have Eric, you have the schedule in front of you. What time is the next thing supposed to start? And
I think I was supposed to have to.
So you have an hour and 5 minutes right now.
Oh, cool. Okay. All right. So I'll keep going. So
we're thinking. Actually, what we're